Hello again, I'm glad you've joined us today as we continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Today we pick up in chapter 9 and verse 14. It says, "When they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. And immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, 'What are you discussing with them?' And one of the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed of a spirit which makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him to the ground. He foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they cannot do it.' And he answered them and said, 'O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me.' And they brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling about and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood.' He said, 'It's often thrown him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us.' And Jesus said to him, 'If you can, all things are possible to him who believes.' And immediately the boy's father cried out and began saying, 'I do believe, help my unbelief.' And when Jesus saw the crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit and said to it, 'You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again.' And after crying out and throwing him into a terrible convulsion, it came out and began so much like a corpse that most of them said, 'He's dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. And when he had come into the house, the disciples began to question him privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And he said to them, 'This kind cannot come out by anything but by prayer.'" Jesus and his disciples, you remember, had been upon the mountain with Peter, James, and John. He had been transfigured before them. And as they come back down off the mountain, he'd instructed them to tell no one of these things until he had been raised from the dead. They were puzzled by that statement, and they can't comprehend his death, which he had been plainly telling them he must go and suffer at the hands of the scribes and be killed and then be raised on the third day. They can't comprehend his death, let alone his resurrection. And they now return from the mountain, and they see the other 9 disciples surrounded by a large crowd. Some of the scribes are arguing with them, and Jesus suddenly appears and learns of the failure of his disciples, unable to cure this man's son. We see the anxiety of this father who had brought his son to be healed. He explains the terrible condition that this young man was in. He'd been in this condition ever since his childhood. When it seizes him, he can't speak. He throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth. He grinds his teeth. He stiffens out. Somebody tries to play this off as being just some type of seizures, but this is plainly done at this time by possession of an unclean spirit. Jesus asked how long, and of course he said again, this has been since his childhood. And he tried to destroy him, sometimes throw him into the fire or into the water. And this father makes a very passionate appeal there in verse 22. He says, "If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Notice Jesus' reply. He didn't say, "Well, sure, I can help. I think I can help you with that." He rather repeats the words of the man, and we don't have the inflection of Jesus' words as to how he said this, but one can only imagine he said it with exclamation. "If you can," as though to say, you have the if in the wrong place. There's no limit on my power. There's no limit on my compassion. And we've seen that over and over. This is the Son of Man who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. If there was any limitation, it would be in his faith, not his ability, not his compassion. And so he says, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." And verse 24, immediately this boy's father cried out and began, "I do believe," but then he says, "Help my unbelief." I think this man wants to trust Jesus for a cure. He had brought him there to be cured. believing, but he recognized the imperfection of his faith, and he's seen the failure of the disciples, but this is the master. And when Jesus saw the crowd rapidly gathering, he rebuked the spirit and told it to come out of him and not enter him again. Of course, at the word of Jesus, this takes place. This demon tears and convulses the body of this young man, but it obeys and comes out of him, leaving the boy's body there just laying like he's dead. In fact, so much so that people said, he's dead. But Jesus takes him by the hand, raises him up, and he's restored wholly. What men could not do, what even his disciples could not do, Jesus did only by his word. This surely is the wonder-working Son of God. This was the last miracle that would be performed in Galilee that's recorded in the Gospel of Mark. But afterwards, in verse 28, when he had come into the house, his disciples began questioning privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. This is a powerful message for us. Whether we're seeking help for ourselves or we're seeking help for someone else, we must have faith, and we must realize that our help comes from the Lord. And when we ask for that help, we ought not have an attitude that if you can do something, then do something. The same answer for us as it was this man. If you can, if that's our question, then we've got the if in the wrong place. All things are possible to him who believes, Jesus says. There's no limitation on God's power. There's no lack of compassion on his part. It's our faith that depends on what he is willing to do, not whether he's able to do it. When we ask, sometimes we ask with little faith. Maybe we ask why our efforts are unsuccessful. His reply may be because we've not prayed to him. We've not asked him in faith. We must come to him in fervent prayer. And we need to realize how faith is connected with answered prayer. James, in James chapter 1 and verse 6, says that we must ask in faith without doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not expect that he'll receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded or unstable in all his ways. Yes, we're to go to ask God. He wants us. He desires us to come and make our requests known to him. But we must come believing that he has all power. Not if he can do something. We know that he can do something. We need to examine our faith. If my faith is lacking, my prayer is lacking. We need to express our faith by believing triumphant prayer. In fact of the matter, there is not one thing that we can ask of God that's according to his will that will not be accomplished. Now you think about it. I want to say that again. There's not one thing that you can ask God that's according to his will that won't be accomplished. That's just a law of God. There's physical laws. It's just that way. You cool water down to 32 degrees, what happens? Well, it freezes. It does that every time. It does it consistently. Well, anything that we ask of God that's according to his will be accomplished. There may be some things, and we'll talk about this later, even the Son of God received the answer no in his prayer to the Father. But if it's according to the will of God, God may be willing to do it. We just need to ask and ask by faith that it be done. It's not that if he can. No, he can. All things are possible to him who believes. And if it's according to his will and we ask, it will be accomplished. Surely causes us to want to be more faithful and more consistent in our prayer. In Mark chapter 9 and verse 30, it says, "And from there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he was unwilling for anyone to know about it. And he was teaching his disciples, telling them, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." But it says, verse 32, they didn't understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Jesus is about to visit Capernaum, kind of been his home base overall through his Galilean ministry, and he's fixing to visit Capernaum for the last time before he leaves to go to Jerusalem and Calvary and the cross. He's tried on many occasions to find seclusion, time to talk and be with his disciples, prepare them for what's coming. And now as he heads southward, he's alone with them, and he's talking to them again very plainly about the fact that he has to go and suffer, be killed, and yet he says he will be raised on the third day. They don't understand this statement, it says, and they were afraid to ask him about it. When they first heard these things, it was, remember, just recently up in Caesarea Philippi, where they'd finally found some time to be alone with the Master. Peter, when he hears this from Jesus that he's going to be killed, Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. And you can imagine, Lord, you're the Son of God. He just confessed that. You're not going to be killed. But he sternly rebukes Peter and tells him that he's not setting his mind on the interests of God, but rather the interests of man. Again, he mentions it to Peter, James, and John when they're on the mountain after they saw his transfiguration, that he's going to be killed and he's going to be raised on the third day. And they were still puzzled. And when they came off the mountain, they seized on this. What does this mean, that he's going to be raised on the third day? The only thing they asked him, they started discussing about Elijah. They didn't understand, Elijah coming first and then the Christ, and he explains that to them. But they still don't ask him about being raised from the dead. This has just blown their mind, the idea that he's going to be killed. He's saying he's going to be killed. They can't comprehend that, let alone the fact that he's going to be raised. But Jesus ties the two together. Later they will see that, but now they can't. He ties the two together. He will be killed, and that's going to be tragic, but it's not going to be the tragic end of a martyr. This is the victory of the Savior. He will be killed, yes, but he will be raised on the third day. But they didn't understand it, and they didn't ask. Mark says they were afraid to ask. Matthew says they were deeply grieved. They couldn't ask about the resurrection because they were stuck on the fact that he was saying he's going to be killed. They thought that was defeat. They couldn't get past that. But it was not defeat. There would be suffering, but there would be glory. And that's a repeating theme throughout the Bible. First comes suffering, and then comes glory. And you must look beyond the suffering to the glory. At this point, they can't do that. They can't get past that he's going to be killed. But what about us? How do we look at things? Do we get past the suffering? Do we get past the temptation? Do we get past the trial? The only way that we're going to be able to overcome the things that we face here is to look beyond those things to the glory. And that's what we're told to do in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, because that's what Jesus did. We're to look to Jesus and his example. Is Jesus going to have to face suffering? Yes. He faces it at the hands of godless men and is crucified. But he endures that because he looked beyond to the glory. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, for he is the author and perfecter of faith. He has paved the way. The author, the word there, very interesting word there in Hebrew. It can be translated the captain, the one who leads and goes first. I like the translation pioneer. It can be rendered that way. He's the pioneer of our faith. Pioneer is one who goes forth first and blazes the trail. And Jesus, we can know that we can get through suffering and trials, all the things that we face in this world, because Jesus did and is now set down at the right hand of God in glory. Jesus did it, and we can too. So he tells us To fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame of the right hand of God. Yes, Jesus had to face suffering. He's telling his disciples, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be killed, but I'll be raised on the third day. There will come glory. And he was able to despise the shame and endure the cross because he looked beyond to that. These disciples at this point can't do that. They will one day, and they will encourage us to do the same. And we must. We must realize, yes, there is suffering in this life. There's trials, there's temptations, but we can overcome. He tells us to take up our cross daily. But we can endure the cross, despise the shame. And one day we can sit down with him on his throne as he has sat down with his Father on his throne. We will be glorified. Well, we'll stop there for our lesson today. A lot of things to consider. Hope you'll be back with us next time as we study the Gospel of Mark. And until then, I hope you have a good day.